Before the middle of the 1960s, people didn't like the idea of wearing clothes that belonged to someone who might have passed away a long time ago. Having endured the rations and restrictions of the Second World War, Americans has entered the age of gleeful consumerism and were focused on all things shiny and new. All clothes referred to as used, worn and second-hand were only for those unfortunate souls who couldn't afford the freshly made stuff. But the world has changed. The latest trends no longer focus solely on novelty and brightness. Each year, ideas of being eco-friendly, expressing individuality, and smart consumption are becoming more prominent. As a result, the demand of second-hand clothes will also grow. Hi everyone, you are on the Cinema.Fashion channel, and today we'll talk about why vintage is the new black, how to choose and mix vintage clothes correctly, and we will delve into the history, aesthetic, and psychology of this phenomenon.
Rack it up, I gotta build up the bank to make me a safe house. Shake it up, she got her hands on her knees and she bringing the cake out. Smoke it up, I got some gas, some packs, I'm up in the greenhouse. Ball it up, I'm with the gang, we taking shots off the rebound. Fucking my posters, say now.
Today, having at least one vintage item in your wardrobe is a sign of a fashionable and even affluent experience. Fashion enthusiasts from all over the world search for exclusive clothing, and retro accessorizers willingly spend crazy amounts of money on them and showcasing their finds on Instagram with the trendy hashtag vintage. But what exactly can be considered vintage? Vintage refers to pieces of clothing, footwear, or accessories that are between 20 and 30 years old, displaying clear signs of the fashion trends of their time. In our current era, the lower limit and reference point for this category can become the 90s. As for antiques, these are items strictly over 50 years old. Moreover, antiques aren't limited to just clothing and accessories, but also include perfumes and cosmetics. Retro, on the other hand, pertains to entirely new items created in the style of past years, essentially designed to look vintage. But not every item with a 20-year history can be considered vintage. It's essential to remember that a vintage item is always exceptional. It may be in fashion now, but simultaneously represent the mood of its era. Additionally, vintage is always associated with a brand, fashion house, or well-known designer. Although vintage clothing has gained significant popularity over the last few decades, it has been around for a century. The term vintage comes from the French word vintage, which means past times. This term first used in the 1920s to describe old-fashioned items that were considered a retrospective of an earlier era. The concept of vintage fashion became popular during the First World War due to a shortage of industrial textiles. As a result, most clothing was either discarded or repurposed into household items like rugs and quilts. During the First World War, the United States initiated a conservation campaign with slogans such as "Make economy fashionable lest it becomes obligatory." One of the outcomes of this campaign was an estimated 10% reduction in waste production during the war. However, it wasn't until the 1960s that vintage truly became a popular trend. Woodstock meant that the hippie lifestyle was prevalent at the time and was positioned as anti-consumerist. People chose to express this by wearing a few items of high-quality clothing instead of filling their closet with fast fashion. This style was seen as a symbol of rebellion against society's norms and conformity, which led to significant growth in the industry. Like most forms of expression and creativity, the history of vintage fashion intertwines with the past social and cultural changes. It's not just about looking good, it's about being a part of something bigger. The fancy dress craze, as it was dubbed in the 1967 Times article, soon took off stateside. In New York in 1965, Harriet Love opened Vintage Chic, a boutique that sold what was then known as antique garments, even though they were just a few decades old. When she first started selling this clothing, Love later wrote, "You had to be a little weird or theatrical to buy it, let alone wear it on days other than Halloween." As more of this fashion-forward young folk wore second-hand clothing in the late 60s and early 70s, their prevalent disdain for used clothes began to shift. Up until a few years ago, wearing some stranger-sold clothes was something only the poorest people did when forced to. Read Cheap Chic, A Guide to Money-Conscious Style, published in 1975. The book declared that it was not only sensible but damned exciting to track down beautiful second-hand clothes. In New York, subcultures were coming together at places like Mud Club, where punk kids crossed paths with rockabilly, reggae, and ska crowds. The music influenced fashion, which influenced the art, which fed back into the cultural Ouroboros, setting off new trends and reintroducing styles from the past. One witness to all this was Roddy Carawella, a long-time vintage clothing enthusiast, classic car collector, and teacher of old-school dance style like Lady Pop and Charleston. Lured by rockabilly music, Carawella was hitting up the Mud Club in the early 80s when Madonna, Basquiat, David Byrne, and the Go-Go's were among crowd that, in Carawella words, were hipsters before hipsters were hipsters. In the 1980s and 1990s, vintage fashion experienced a consolidation. During this period, designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Vivienne Westwood emerged, making their return to the past effect one of their distinctive features. Additionally, the practice of thrifting gained popularity in these years, involving their purchase of used clothing from thrift stores and flea markets. This practice, originating in the USA, spread worldwide, contributing to the growing popularity of vintage fashion. Like most forms of self-expression and creativity, the history of vintage fashion intertwined the social and cultural changes of the past. It's not just about looking good, but more importantly, about being a part of something bigger. A good quality vintage boutique will typically be owned by someone passionate about vintage goods with the experience and connection needed to obtain top-tailored vintage stock. Boutiques tend to be more curated and drilled down. Some may even have a specialty. You will be able to ask the owner or boutique staff about the garments and their age, rarity, and get an understanding of the garment. Other more general vintage stores may be a bit more chaotic and chock-full with less knowledgeable staff, but they will still have some gems to be uncovered. In less curated outlet, there can be an ocean of products, over 95% of which may be forgettable. A way to navigate packed trails of clothing is to quickly thumb through the rail or run your head along the garments to pick up anything that feels good quality or different. This will help you to separate the wheat from the chaff. You can also do this with your eyes if you're a bit more experienced in typical fabrics or patterns. Labels can tell a lot about the garment's age, in some cases if you can date it to the year. You can consider the features of a label to tell if something is old, or at least filter out things that are never and barely vintage. Woven care labels are generally a sign that the pieces is on the older side. Never garments made in the last 20 years are more likely to have synthetic printed labels. The same goes to the garments materials which are indicated on the label. Vintage clothing was much more often made with natural fibers, cotton, linen, wool, and others, than new ones. There are of course exceptions like rayon and viscose Hawaiian shirts, but if you're staring at a label that declares 48% of cotton, 30% of polyester, and 20% of rayon and 2% of lycra, the garment is probably not born of the past. The same concept can be applied to the trims and fastening of vintage piece. Look out for metal zippers and snap closures as opposite to plastic or vinyl ones, especially from older hardware manufacturers like Universal and Crown. Older garments will also be more likely to feature horn, wool, pearl, or metal bottoms as opposite to plastic ones. What else is worth paying attention to? Damage. Due to the age and multiple owners of some vintage garments, you may encounter some damage like holes, cigarette burns, tears, and rips. Some damage, of course, will add a character of a garment, but this is subjective. Creasing. Some less curated vintage outlets reserve bulk shipments of vintage clothing packed into large bags or boxes. Some less ironable garments like outerwear and shirts made of felt or wool can suffer from this with damage or those crease lines. Now that we understand how to find vintage pieces, let's see how you can wear them to create a unique personal style. Here are some tips. Choose high-quality vintage clothing that will last for a long time and will later fit your figure. Combine vintage clothing with modern clothes to create a balanced and up-to-date image. Experiment with combinations trying to create a unique and individual outfit. Don't be afraid to combine different styles, for example, a trench coat with the Converse All-Stars. Remember that vintage clothes have their own history. Also get pleasure creating clothes that affect your personality and tell something about you. The fascination with vintage fashion isn't solely about appearances. It's an intricate interplay of psychology and individuality. According to WSL, Gen Z spends roughly 40% more time browsing thrift shops than any other generation, and for a good reason too. What is nostalgia? As defined by Merriam-Webster, nostalgia is a wistful or excessively sentimental yearning for a return to or of some past period or irrecoverable condition. When we ruminate on a past immersed in our senses of nostalgia, we prolong this cycle, looking back on people who are also looking back, all of us yearning for a gold age that is long gone. As humans, our desires are insatiable. We always want something we do not and often cannot have. Fashion therefore repeats itself as we try to relive the past we never experienced it, and designers often use this as a muse, shaping it to fit their future by designing a season in advance. It may be said that the force, the past and the future to merge created a present based on nostalgic instinct. Do you ever stop to wonder why your favorite trends might be the same ones you find in your or your parents' clothes from the 90s? This is due to the 20-year trend. The 20-year trend cycle is a cyclical concept that states that every 20 years popular trends will arrive at the forefront once more. In 1937, British author and fashion historian James Larry came up with a timeline of how fashion styles are viewed over the years. This set of rules is known as Larry's Law and states that if someone wears a popular style 1 year after its peak time, they will be considered dowdy, 10 years after hiders, and 150 years after beautiful. We often look back and idealize the past, especially the decades we didn't fully experience or didn't experience at all. I grew up on 19th movies and TV shows, just like many of my viewers. I cherish this period with my fond feelings because it's connected to my childhood. However, if you revisit cult films of that time now, many will surprise you with jokes that normalize racism, sexism, and homophobia, things that are unexpected today. While both good and bad happened in every decade, the media often filters out these things, leaving our current generation with only nostalgic photos and cool retro aesthetic. We often romanticize the past to fit the narrative chosen by the media, or even ourselves, regardless of its accuracy. So instead of constantly looking back and romanticizing our own or others' histories, let's focus on staying in the present and creating our own lives here and now, living them as unique individuals. And let vintage fashion help us with that. Friends, thank you for being with me today. Write comments and share your stories about your unique vintage finds. And for today, see you and bye-bye.